Mosque of Winston-Salem. He is also the ICNA Vice President for Social Justice and Civic Engagement, an illustrious resume. And he's also a board member for the Institute for Dismantling Racism, among also the founding member of Muslims for Social Justice. Let me introduce to you all a very well-known speaker and an expert in my mind on this subject, Imam Khalid Griggs, who's joining us from North Carolina. So please, Imam Khalid, it's all yours.
Bismillah. Assalamu alaikum, brothers and sisters. It's my pleasure to be able to share a few moments with you this afternoon to talk about one of the most momentous moments in American history. And I say this without hyperbole. I'm not exaggerating when I say that for the first time I know in my adult life, we are finding ourselves having honest discussions about one of the fundamental ills, or the fundamental ill of American society, and this is racism and structural institutional racism. And more specifically, we are, for the first time in my adult life, not just amongst people who are being victimized by white supremacy, but we are now having those who have been passive and silent partners in the victimization of African-American people in this nation and other people of color. But at this moment in history, we're talking about anti-Black racism specifically, not to deny the impact that white supremacy and structural racism may have on other folks. But at this moment in history, the emphasis is on anti-Black racism. And when we try to find solutions or offer up solutions, I think we have to first begin with ourselves. We have to question whether or not we are passive and complicit in allowing the system, the structural system of racism to exist in the format that it has, even just in our lifetime. Have we been silent in the face of these things, or have we tried? And are we working towards becoming anti-racist ourselves? It's not enough for us to say that we don't use racist language, we don't have overt feelings of racism towards people who don't look like ourselves. But what we must do, particularly those who are members of the Muslim community, we have to be anti-racist, as our Prophet Muhammad ﷺ was an anti-racist. He just didn't tell Abu Dhar, when Abu Dhar made statements to Bilal ibn Rabah, who was a Black African Muslim at the time of the Prophet Muhammad, peace be upon him. The Prophet didn't just say, Abu Dhar, it's not nice what you're doing. He equated Abu Dhar's expression, racist expression to Bilal, with having faith himself. And so as Muslims, we are not allowed to sit passively and just watch what's going on in the society. Now, very quickly, I want to suggest just a few things that all of us need to do. First and foremost, if we're talking about killer cops and brutality against Black folks by policemen, we have to start by reimagining policing in this country. We all know that U.S. policing originated, the model was based on slave patrols. And if we know anything about that function, we can easily make the connection between the way that police officers around the country have victimized African-American men, women, and children with impunity. For the most part, nothing has been done to them. So I think to begin with, we have to reimagine the way that policing is done in this country. Small reforms are not going to fundamentally change the problems and the issues that we're confronted with today. But I will just suggest just a few things. There's no national database in this country for police officers who murder through extrajudicial killings on the street. There's no national database to track these individuals from one law enforcement agency to the next. Like in the case a few years ago of Tamir Rice, the 12-year-old boy who was playing with a toy in a park, and police jumped out in 12 seconds, has shot and killed this boy. Well, the one who pulled the trigger on this 12-year-old boy just went to another department. We have even more recently, we have this Derek Carvin who killed George Floyd by having his knee on his neck for the period that he did. This is a man also who had a long track record of abuse and discriminatory actions against Black people and people of color, but yet he did what he did with impunity. There's no national tracking mechanism so that we know what these police officers are doing. In many cities around the country, there's no community oversight. And I'll be finished here in 1 second. There's no community oversight for police officers. And so whenever there are charges of discrimination, it just goes back to the police department for the most part to investigate themselves. And the police unions are so empowered that they're able to protect from prosecution, and they're able to get these people back on jobs when they have obviously committed acts, extrajudicial acts against folks. So I see Brother Shujat is back, so I guess my time is up, and so I'll stop at this particular point.
No, indeed. Indeed, words of wisdom, Imam Khalid. Notable among them, as I've noted down, the first obstacle is ourselves. Have we been silent in the face of this crisis? And I think for a large part, the Muslim community has sort of kept ourselves insulated, which going forward absolutely cannot be the case. And inshallah, we have to get more involved on a general level, on a family level, on a personal level, on a masjid level, on a community level. And inshallah, going forward, this discussion and this webinar is hopefully a good start and a testament to the fact that we all have to be willing to come forward and affect change, positive change. So to all the speakers and all the audience, the format of our webinar here is that once the speaker has stated the initial comments, I am going to ask them a question that the CAPI organization has deemed to be a good fit for given the speaker's profile and their experience. So I guess my first question, and the only question I'm going to ask, one per each speaker, Imam Khalid, Reverend Martin Luther King was preaching nonviolence to Black Americans, citing India's Gandhi, Mahatma Gandhi, as a mentor or as a legacy. Has the Gandhian principle failed to deliver humanity from the supremacist ideology in America, India, for that matter, Palestine and elsewhere? Can and should the grassroots movement post rest in peace George Floyd's murder be mobilized into an operating system? Do you think?
Yes. That's a very good two-part question. And I'd like to address it like this. First and foremost, not only the non-violent philosophy that was espoused by Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. and Mahatma Gandhi, I don't think there's been any ideology or any embracing of an ideology that has practically impacted and dismantled systems of white supremacy in the United States or anywhere else. With Black people, African-American people, doing the Black freedom struggle, starting in modern times in the mid-1950s up until, say, the middle or the late part of the 1970s. Dr. King, before his assassination on April the 4th, 1968, was one and perhaps the most dominant and most prominent voice for the Black freedom struggle up until the period of his assassination. But his was not the only voice. And whereas Dr. King espoused and truly a heartfelt philosophy of nonviolence. Dr. King and that Black freedom struggle under his leadership incorporated, in my estimation, common sense. And so on many occasions, there was an organization that was organized in the South, in Louisiana, more specifically, called the Deacons for Defense. And these were church deacons, African-American men who were actually deacons in their local churches who had come together. Almost all of them had military, US military background. And they had come together, and even though Dr. King's movement was a nonviolent movement, they had come to protect these nonviolent protesters and marchers at a particular point in the civil rights movement. There were voices during this time like El-Hajj Malik Shabazz, Malcolm X, who were not espousing nonviolence as a philosophy, as a way of life. As a matter of fact, towards the end of his life, Dr. King himself, and you can read like his last book, and there are other speeches that he made in the last year of his life. Where do we go from here? Chaos to community. Chaos to community. In this particular book, he was questioning nonviolence as a tactic himself. And many, like myself, in reading about and studying and being around people who were around Dr. King, his relatives and others, Dr. King was questioning the tactics that he had used throughout his civil rights career. And these are things that are documented in his own words and it's documented in his own writings. Dr. King even questioned this idea. He said, you know, sometimes I wonder whether I'm trying to integrate people into a burning house. He said, you know, it's good to go to an integrated lunch counter, but it would really be bad if the milk that I'm drinking at the lunch counter is radioactive. So the philosophy of nonviolence as a complete system, as the only alternative to social change, even at the time of Dr. Martin Luther King, this is something that Dr. King himself had started to question because of the effectiveness or lack of effectiveness. And
It looks like we have some technical difficulties. Imam Khalid, your voice, neither your video is coming through to us. Okay, it's unfortunate. A very good, deep philosophical answer, and unfortunately technology has to play spoilsport in this. But you've got so many positives. We're here all because of technology. Okay, please.
Okay. Can you hear anything?
Yes, yes. You're coming through clear now, video and audio. Please proceed.
Okay, very good. Yeah, so Dr. King, particularly in the last couple of years, and more specifically the last year of his life, had started to question the effectiveness of nonviolence as a philosophy and not as a tactic. In my humble opinion, in my analysis of this Black freedom struggle and Dr. King, even looking at the struggle in India, when Gandhi, not the political head, but was perhaps the most influential voice at a particular time when India was trying to cast off the British colonial rule there in India, that but Dr. King's embrace of nonviolence at the end of his life was an embrace of it as a tactic and not as a philosophy. And to me, in my humble opinion, it's very similar in the way that we as Muslims are prescribed in Islam, how we look at the issue of struggle, fighting and struggle and peaceful protests against opposition. For 13 years of the mission, as we all know who are Muslim, 13 years of the Prophet Muhammad's life, it was a non-violent. There was no organized, there was no group physical assault or physical action taking against those who were opposing them and hurting them, these kinds of things. But for the last 10 years, when the Muslims from Allah had the authority from the divine to fight those who were fighting you, then the underlying philosophy of nonviolence was now turned into a tactic that when it's appropriate, when you're not being attacked, when the conditions are right, then you need to defend yourself, and you need to. This was a part of the movement of Islam under the Prophet Muhammad, peace be upon him. And I see parallels that where nonviolence is a workable tactic, but not necessarily a philosophy of life, that nothing can be done in opposition to those who are being oppressed outside of the exercise of nonviolent tactics.
Awesome. That was a quite deep topic and a lot of philosophical stuff in it, but do appreciate you sharing your thoughts with us in answering this quite honestly a very deep and philosophical question. So thank you again.
Brother Shuja, let me just give me 1 minute to address the second part of the question. And
sure.
Can and should the grassroots movement post Mr. George Floyd murder be mobilized into an operating system? Is something that from a social change perspective and just utilizing dynamics of social change, this is an ideal. This is definitely something that we would strive for. The implementation is another story. This has been a very broad-based cross-ideological and religious, socioeconomic. This has crossed all of those barriers. This has truly been a fusion movement of people coming together from all walks of life to decry what happened not just to Mr. George Floyd, but what has been continually happening to Black people by police, what's happening in the courts, what's happening with mass incarceration, as aspects or elements of structural racism in this country. So ideally, this is definitely what we would want. I don't know, I haven't seen it happen in recent times. Maybe this is the time when all of us can stay together.
I've asked him to look into the chat message, but I think it's better
coming together as a sunnah, as an operating system for those who are protesting this type of injustice in this country.
Right.
Okay, thank you. Thank you. And for the rest of our audience, please hang around. Once we're done with all the speakers, we will have a Q&A session. I'd also like to remind everyone that in the comment section, you can post your question, and our moderator, myself and Masood Bhai, Mr. Masood Rab, we will try to get as many comment questions lined up and presented to the speakers to get their thoughts and comments on this one. So, and also please, I encourage everyone to go back and seek answers to these questions as well that we're asking the speakers. Write them down, and inshallah, hopefully this should give you some food for thought as you go about doing your research on the topic as well. And this is for all of the attendees as well. So moving onwards, we're running a little short on time, but we have, alhamdulillah, enough to go through. My next speaker, and I again thank him for joining. He is someone who's a star on the Detroit scene. He's a tireless advocate for civil rights, human rights, and justice, proven leadership skills, bridge builder in the community of diverse ethnicities, a spiritual and intellectual counselor. Don't have enough words to state all of his achievements, but I have seen him in person be the moderator for the American Human Rights Council annual banquet that happens, I'd like to present to you none other than our own Michigan Imad Hamad, Imad, please take it on from here.
Well, thank you, brother, and thank you all for the guest speakers and the audience, those who are on the call, as well as who are listening to us at large. I would like to start by noting that George Floyd murder and senseless crime came to reaffirm our common humanity and came to affirm that racism is a universal challenge. It's part of every makeup, part of every society. There is no place that can be free of racism. It's this unfortunate reality that racism and discrimination are continued challenge facing humanity at large. And as long as mankind exists, it is the unfortunate reality that this challenge will continue to exist. That doesn't mean that we surrender to it. That does not mean that we accept it. That does not mean that we tolerate it. That does not mean that we don't do our homework to fight and fight hard to contain it, to make it costly to those who cross the line, regardless who they are. So I just want to make sure that we understand this core issue here as a base for the much needed dialogue and the much needed local and national conversation about this ongoing challenge of police excessive use of force, as well as police brutality and its victims, regardless who, and particularly within the African American community, who have been the ultimate victims of such systematic, deep-rooted racism in America. Definitely, we are to be reminded as well that general labeling and general condemnation is wrong. It's like a statement to say every white is racist, or every black is bad, or every Muslim is a terrorist, etc., etc., and the list is long. So we cannot be driven by this notion of general condemnation, even against police at large and law enforcement at large. There are many good, honorable law enforcement officers who, at the end of the day, doing their job honorably. They are the first responders that we call on when we face issues, safety and security challenges, not by the name of the bad that do exist and been existing as part of this pre-existing culture that made it to grow and grow and grow, that reached this level that we're facing at this time. But at the same time, we cannot doom the notion of partnership and the notion of dialogue, as hard as it is, as frank as it is, no sugarcoating to the issues and no sugarcoating to the real problems that we are facing when we talk about police brutality as one of the most challenging police practices in America. And by the way, even the technique that the police used that led to this senseless killing and murder of Mr. Floyd, it's a technique that's used by police agencies across the world. So it's not just limited to America. As one, it is the unfortunate reality challenging police practices. Police work is in America, and by the way, it's not one standard that the police is subject use to the localities led to the senseless legislations and laws and regulations. That's why you see some states legalize these techniques and some states do not. And that mandate, as I noted earlier, a real serious conversation and engagement. I think we're at the time where we're at the time of no return. I think policing in America will not and should not be the same after Mr. Floyd senseless murder. Mr. Floyd was just an ordinary man. He wasn't a celebrity. He wasn't like a famous, let's say, civil rights leader or activist. He was just an ordinary man who wanted just to be. He wanted just to exist. However, his death brought not just a local and national anger, but universal anger, facing the challenge of racism that faces all nations, not just America. So America have a deep-rooted challenge of racism that goes against the core American values. And indeed, that puts us all together as one team in order to address this challenge and render the real reforms, the much needed reforms. It's way overdue for these reforms and policing practices to take place at all levels in America. Again, now the whole world is looking at America and see how we are dealing with this crisis or this challenge. And I know that people don't like to see us fail the same way we failed compacting or addressing the COVID-19 crisis. And they have a common angle, which is our common humanity when it comes to be at risk. So time is due to move forward. And I think the change can be done. It's possible and it's real. And I think the movement that we witnessed, which was diverse, included everyone. And that's what made it unique. Not only those who were affected, who moved to convey anger and demand the change, but those who even were not direct victims of it came to join this movement. And that's what makes it real, unique, and promising to mandate the change that we all desire.
Thank you, Ahmad. Thank you for those comments. And my question, I guess, to you is, and this is the gravity of the situation, as much as we are trying to look forward and develop solutions, unfortunately, there are things around us that seem to happen that always seem to, at least in perception, take us back a step. But we cannot let that demoralize us. So I guess, and I'll give you a little bit of background on this one, right? And growing up in this country, and looking at what's happening, I draw in a parallel where I was born and I grew up in India. The similar type of, I guess, discrimination, racism, the RSS ideology that is currently spreading hate in India against all minorities, Christians, Muslims, Dalits. Actually, RSS is an acronym for the Hindu supremacist organization that takes its roots in the ideology of the Nazis, the KKK, and the Fascist Party of World War II. And in current modern times, these ideologies in India are causing hundreds of lynchings of religious minorities. The political wing of this RSS is the BJP, and they won enough parliament seats that enabled them to form the government. So that's over there. But they have exported their brand in their foreign wing, which is called the HSS, Hindu Swayam Sevak Sangh, and that's a Sanskrit name. The HSS is an acronym, which has a similar ideology of hate, and they have been able to establish 172 local chapters in USA, including four in Michigan, and this is a factory of hate. So as much as we are trying to overcome and look solutions into our existing problems, our problems seem to, at least, some known and some not as well known. So my question to you is, can the American legislature use political and diplomatic pressure to provide relief to religious minorities in all countries from religious-based oppression? Can these surrogate groups of these ultra-right fascist parties like the HSS that are setting up shop in America, shall they be banned? And will that set up a good precedent to say, hey, discrimination, overt, explicit, declared discrimination by someone as their, a modi of operation? How do we go after such organizations?
Well, as I said, racism, hate are universal. And that's why when we talk about the human rights, we cannot be selective about it. We cannot be optional. Human rights are human rights that are applicable to every human being, to every nation on this earth. Human rights are God-made rights, not man-made rights. And every human being should be entitled to these basic human rights of respect and dignity. Now, in India, definitely, any form or shape of ethnic cleansing and discrimination and racism and bigotry and aggression and oppression of any minorities is condemned and goes against the international law. However, we live in an era where hypocrisy and double standards is the rule, is the norm. It's this international power engagement and agendas, which, for example, if we were to witness such crimes against humanity, against minorities in India, against Muslims in India in particular, the world turned their back and try even to justify it by the name of the political interest and the political agendas. Look what happened in Rwanda, Burma. Look what's happening in Palestine. Look what's happening in many parts of the world. So it's that notion of double standards where, unfortunately, those who are on control, they define that aspect of the human rights as it serves their political agendas. Definitely, any extremist group, any group that advocate for hate, any group that advocate for violence, any a group that carries such political manifests should be outlawed and should be not allowed to have any form or shape of freedom of even expression. I know that freedom of expression is a basic precious right in America. It's part of our Bill of Rights. We pride ourselves with it. But there is that fine line that freedom of speech and freedom of assembly or what have you are not just a blind process. They should come with responsibility and conscience. So, yes, we have to name things as is. We have to name it by name. We cannot sugarcoat it. So it's appalling. However, we have to admit that these giant powers that control the political game, they pick and choose, and they become to be selective. So what I see as, let's say, a great political organization or a great political movement, it might be seen as the devil, while the devil is seen as an angel in their eyes. So this is part of the challenge. Definitely, that puts a big responsibility on all of us, how to better engage and how to advance our engagement to create better understanding, better awareness, and that engagement should take course at all levels with fellow different communities as well as elected officials at all levels. Indeed, the political pressure, indeed, if we were to compel our legislators on a state level, on a Congress level, that helps a lot. The political statement helps a lot, although sometimes it's just a political statement that many times does not carry any real political power or substance to render the change, because at the end of the day, it's mandated to these high-level, up-level political agendas. And here, we have to name it as is. The U.S. foreign policy is not being, it's not a policy that is fair and balanced when it comes to these issues.
Yeah, thank you for those words of wisdom. Imad, we will come back to you after the session. All the speakers are done, and we will start with some Q&A afterwards. I'm going to move on to my next speaker. The next speaker is local to Detroit, Michigan. Mark Crane. Mark Crane is a well-known personality around the Detroit advocacy and political scene. He's a digital strategist and community organizer with national experience as well. After running a web development firm, Mark led communications at Chicago Inner City Muslim Action Network and then ran several digital programs at Obama 2012. He's also the co-founder of Empowered Change, a rapid response campaigning organization that mobilizes Muslims and their allies, as well as the executive director of Dream of Detroit. And that's the poster that I see behind you, Mark. It's coming through clear. Awesome, good placement. Mark has worked on successful campaigns to prevent U.S. military intervention in Syria, expand Medicaid access in GOP-led states, and take down the Confederate flag in South Carolina. So with such an illustrious resume, without much of my further ado, Mark, the stage is all yours, sir. We're having some difficulty hearing audio from you, Mark. You do show you're not on mute. The sign in the... Nope.
Can you hear me now?
Yes, we can.
Great. Too many webinars, too many input sources. Please forgive me. Bismillahirrahmanirrahim. Alhamdulillahi Rabbil Alameen. Wassalatu wassalamu ala Rasulillah. Assalamu alaikum, everyone. Peace to all of our guests. I'm very grateful to be here with y'all this afternoon. Very grateful for the words of Imam Khalid and our brother Imad and the other speakers that I'm eager to hear. So I will try to keep my remarks brief, inshallah ta'ala. As a brother Shuja mentioned, I do a lot of my work here in Detroit, in particular with our organization Dream of Detroit, which has been trying to combine community organizing with community development to revitalize our neighborhood here on the west side of the city. And if you're familiar with Detroit, we're in an area anchored by the Muslim Center of Detroit, which has been here for the last 35 years or so. I also do some work nationally with a group called Move On, which maybe many of you are familiar with. We're a national membership-based organization. So I'm sort of bringing both of those lenses. But I want to start, really by talking about Detroit. And this has been a really, interesting moment that we've been in since the murder of George Floyd. And it's been incredible, frankly, to watch the Muslim community response in particular, but folks across the board, obviously. There was a couple of studies that came out last week, one from Kaiser and another, I think, from an entity called Navigators, that showed somewhere between 17 and 25 million people have been out at live protests since the murder of George Floyd in this country. 17 to 25 million people at live protests. So that doesn't even include the webinars. That doesn't include all of the political education that people are doing at home. That's people out in the streets. I mean, this is really perhaps the biggest protest moment in our history that we're living through right now. And it's incredible. And so it's been interesting both to see the Muslim community talk about anti-racism work and the work that we need to do to rid ourselves and our cultures of racist ideas, but also to see us talk about racial justice and what does it mean to impact policy right now, and what should our priorities be when it comes to policy. So in that spirit of racial justice, I'll frame my remarks today. So again, Detroit is a really unique situation. In the city of Detroit, we've had Black political leadership for a very long time. We're a city that is 85% Black. We elected our first Black mayor in 1972. And Coleman Young, our first Black mayor, largely ran on a police reform platform in 1972. A lot of folks don't know that there was a unit in the Detroit Police Department called the Stress Unit, which was notorious for brutalizing people, an all-white police unit that was notorious for brutalizing citizens in Detroit. And what we find is that when you look back at the 1967 and 68 rebellions across this country, a full half of them, the immediate preceding moment before the rebellion launched was an act of police brutality, right? And so when our first Black mayor comes into office in 1972, running against police brutality, that leads us to this moment in time today where Detroit's police force is actually 50% Black, 56% Black, right? Compare that to something like 21 or 22% in the city of Chicago, 15% in New York City. So we live in a city that has been confronting police brutality for a very long time, a city that has seen significant reforms to its police department, and particularly to the demographic makeup of the police department. And yet, despite that political control, despite the fact that we have a police department that looks more like the people that it polices, right, we still have systemic issues, even with our police department. And so I'm reminded in particular of two people who I'll name, one being a brother named Abdullah Abdul Muhammad. Locally, he went by the nickname Abdullah Beard. And he was killed in 2018 by the Detroit police when they were issuing a search warrant at 4:30 a.m. and stormed into his house and found him laying on the couch. And he was armed, as frankly as he has a right to be in his own home. And we won't critique what folks do to protect themselves in their neighborhoods. But the fact that this was a search warrant that was issued and executed at 4:30 a.m. That the brother was caught off guard, that he was not the subject of the warrant by any means, that he was simply a person in the property and was killed on the spot by an over-militarized police force. Now that's a brother from our local community, and so I mentioned his name in particular, but I also remind folks, and this is perhaps a more well-known name, of Ayanna Stanley Jones, right? Do we know Ayanna Stanley Jones? This was the young girl who was 7 years old, who was killed 10 years ago by the Detroit Police Department, right? And what's so tragic about this particular scenario is, again, of course, they were entering the home in pursuit of someone that had nothing to do with her. But this raid was being filmed for a nationally televised TV show, right? Maybe you've heard of Live PD on A&E. And so what we have here is this sort of unholy relationship between police departments all across this country and Hollywood that further exacerbates the problems that we see with the departments in the first place. Because what's happening if you're executing a raid and you've got a television crew from a national show following you, right? There's extra posturing, right? There's an extra sort of macho, machismo, we might say in Spanish, right? This is extra sort of, you want to look good, you want to show off. And what you do is you put on your best army face and you go in to put on a show of force, and all that show of force, you kill an innocent 7-year-old girl. Right. And this was a case that it was only a year and a half ago that this family saw any sort of closure from the murder of this young woman with a settlement with the city. And we know that that isn't real closure for the taking of a child. So I mention those things in particular because I'm proud of the legacy of Black political leadership in the city of Detroit. And I think it's made a significant difference in how folks live in our city. And yet, and still, it's not enough to challenge a police system that is problematic to its core and from its founding. And Imam Khalid talked about the slave patrols in the South. And we know that in the North, modern police departments, in the mid 1800s, were putting down labor revolts, basically, right? So the history of policing in this country is one specifically designed to police Black bodies and also to police poor folks in general. And that's in the North and the South. And so, when we talk about police reform, the phrase of the moment is defund the police, right? This is the call that we've all heard. And I think across the country, organizers have done an incredible job of keeping us focused on this main clarion call of defunding the police, right? And here in Detroit, with folks with organizations like the coalition called Frontline Detroit, what they'll say is not just defund the police, but defund the police and refund the people, right? Because that's the second part of the concept that folks get hung up on, this idea of defund the police. In Detroit, we know very well Betsy DeVos, right? She's our national labor education secretary now. But if you're in Michigan, you know the impact and the reach of the DeVos family. And for decades, from their perch in Western Michigan, they've been attacking our schools in the city of Detroit. And Betsy DeVos said, we're going to defund the Detroit public schools. And I promise you, you didn't hear nearly as much outrage behind her saying we're going to defund the Detroit public schools as you've heard when people say we're going to defund the police. But we have to, sometimes we have to adjust our messaging if it isn't nuanced enough for folks at the outset. And so we're not just saying defund the police, but refund the people, because we're talking about a reallocation of resources into methods that really serve public safety in our communities, right? We're not talking about just defunding the police immediately with no replacement, or with no increased mental health services, or with no community response teams that could go into neighborhoods instead of armed police, right? We're talking about moving those funds into alternatives that we know will keep us safe. So I'll start to wrap up my remarks here by just saying, we know that the police don't keep us safe. And again, Detroit is an example of this. In 2002, Detroit had 4,200 police officers. Today, because of budget cuts due to a shrinking city and other reasons, we have 2,000 police officers. In 2002, we had 2,057 violent crimes per 100,000 people in the city of Detroit. In 2018, we had 2,008 violent crimes per 100,000 residents in the city of Detroit. So in a 20-year span, we reduced the police force by half, and violent crime did not go up at all, right? The proof is in the pudding that we don't actually need police in their current form to keep us safe. And this is the reason that we stand fully behind this call to defund them and to refund the people and to move those resources again into services that actually support us. So in the interest of time, I'll wrap there and, again, appreciate everyone's participation this afternoon.
Yep, Brother Mark, the question that I have for you goes in line with the questions that were asked earlier, is that, as the saying goes, if you have a question, ask an expert or someone who's well-versed with that field. So after having asked the question that we did about with Reverend Dr. Martin Luther King and the Gandhian principles to George Floyd, onwards to banning of organizations, all of these are proposed solutions that people have said, well, can these happen? And that's why we have this expert panel that can hopefully, inshallah, answer some of these questions. So I guess my question to you is, can the existing police force in America be subjected to testing or retesting, i.e. a psychological exam and polygraph tests? What would it take to enforce this type of testing, or the world famous personality test, which is coincidentally called the Minnesota Multiphasic Personality Inventory, or MMPI for short, which explores the psychopathology of one's personality and may be crucial where mental health issues could have the potential to impair decision-making, especially a microsecond decision-making more faced by the police, or affect the way that one carries out their function. So is it possible that we can have, or, one of the solutions could be to say, hey, subject this type of a standard test that other civil servants, if they're joining government or if they're going through other jobs, security clearances, if all of those people go through that, well, why can't our police?
Mm-hmm. I think it's a good question. And I'll try not to give too winding of an answer. I think in our priorities in this moment should be centered around not giving police departments any more resources, financial resources in particular. Like the reward for oppression should not be bigger budgets, right? The reward for clearly documented violence with clear biases and clear impacts on particular communities should not be that the same people perpetrating that violence then get more money to all of a sudden train themselves to be better, right? And the importance of budgets is this, right? Because we know that money gets reallocated. Let's look at the federal budget and the fact that the just this last week, the court said that the president cannot reallocate military spending to his wall project on the southern border, which he's been doing for the last 2.5 years. Same thing with the police department. This money, you allocate an extra $10 million to a department for increased psychological testing. That money can get used in any particular types of ways, or it can get used to plug holes that allow resources that were allocated elsewhere to be spent, on whether it's for military equipment, et cetera. So let me just put that out there. We need to entertain ideas that don't increase overall police budgets. That should be our starting point, right? Secondly, this is an issue of challenging the system as much as possible, and not the individuals necessarily, because again, the system itself is dysfunctioning, or functioning by design, perhaps, if we again look at Imam Khalid, the history that he shared with us. But the reality is that these police departments, I have an uncle who is a 30-year veteran of the Detroit Police Department. I have no reason in the world to think ill of every police officer that I encounter, right? I have no reason, and I try, Husn al-Dhan, we try to give the benefit of the doubt to everyone, not just our co-religionists, right? But the fact of the matter is, despite all the well-meaning individuals who are involved in the police justice system, again, the system itself is damaged. So we need to be talking about withdrawing police departments from federal programs that transfer military weapons to those departments. We need to be talking about denying benefits and pensions to officers who are under investigation for using excessive force. We need to be talking about requiring officers to contribute to the lawsuits that they cause through their use of excessive force. We need to be talking about taking police out of schools entirely, just like we saw in Minneapolis, where they broke the contract with the Minneapolis PD. Right, the very presence of officers in our schools is a causal factor in the school to prison pipeline that's criminalizing kids for doing things that kids do, and then setting them down an irrevocable path toward the criminal justice system. So there are so many things that we can do to defund the system as it is, to reallocate resources. But whenever we look at any policy solution, because of course there will be many, and not all will get us 100% toward our goal, but we should still pursue them. But we should ask, is this policy proposal going to further inflate police department budgets? And if that answer is yes, that policy proposal really shouldn't be considered in this moment.
Thank you. Thank you for your words of wisdom and insight. That's a good way to look at that. And your experience with the Detroit Police and the city of Detroit goes a long way in formulating that answer. So thanks again. Allow me to move forward, and I'm going to ask my next two speakers. We are over the allocated time, so I am extremely apologetic of the fact that we have run a little bit over time. But if you can stay on, and my next speaker here is Bill Myers. Bill is the current founder and the executive director of One Hamtramck LLC. and the former chair of the Hamtramck Human Relations Commission. Both organizations address racial justice, Islamophobia, and all forms of discrimination, period. Apart from being a social justice and cultural activist for over 40 years, Bill is, and this is my favorite part, he's also a professional musician, a band leader, music director, and writer. And his YouTube page, Bill Meyer Music, has some awesome videos of his productions. And Bill works primarily in the African American community, producing multiple shows, including the Detroit Tribune, one of many to name. And currently his group works at Bird's Jazz Club in the Eastern Market, a Center for Black Culture. And with that introduction, Bill, I'm gonna let you have and express your thoughts and comments on what you think of a solution phase. Bill, you're on mute. We can't hear you.
Mute. Okay. Can you hear me now?
Yes.
Yes.
You can hear. Okay, fine. Thank you very much, first of all, for asking me to be on this panel. I noticed that I'm the token white male in this whole group here, and I don't mind being it because it's a white problem. Racism is a white problem in America, which is a white power country. This is, we know the history of the U.S. is based on exploitation of labor through slavery. And we also know that we created settler colonialism policies by killing natives that lived here, stole their land, and we're still doing that. There's still a white power structure all these years. So it's not surprising that racism is an element of that, because it's a tool to help divide people and keep people fighting each other and not working together. So what's happening right now in history is a very important stage, because people are coming together again in history on massive scale to make change in the United States. It's very important what's going on. Many things have changed. There's many solutions being provided. But I just want to, before I offer some solutions, and I appreciate the comments from the previous guests. I appreciate the fact that Brother Khalid said, made the point about it's not enough to be non-racist, you have to be anti-racist. This was a quote by Angela Davis, as a matter of fact, the great revolutionary black woman activist. And there was the point, I think, in one of the solutions is that you have to really address this issue directly. And it's a subject that no one wants to talk about, especially in the white community, because most white people think we're post-racial, that there's no racism anymore, that we're all getting along fine, and all of this stuff happens, and all of a sudden we realize, no, there's problems in the country. Many people don't want to address problems, even in your own home, and it's very common to avoid problems. But the definition of racism, first of all, I think we should check here, because recently there was a request to change the definition in the Merriam-Webster dictionary. I don't know if you're aware of that. Racism is a system in which a racial majority is able to enforce power and privilege over another race through political, economic, and institutional means. That means people who are not white cannot be racist. They can be prejudiced. Reverse racism is a myth that doesn't exist. It's a prejudice with no power. Racism is prejudice plus power. When you are white and you have power in the country, you have power over other races. And that's what racism ultimately is. So when you hear about Muslims who are racist, there's no such thing as that. They're victims of racism also, by the way. But anyways, I want to get to the point of the fact that the police in our country, and in most capitalist countries, are just enforcing the arm of the government. In most countries, this is their role. They're tasked with maintaining the status quo. A country, especially in this country, which is rife with injustice and poverty and racism. The white power structure that rules the country through banks and corporations is by its very name racist. When you say white power, that's a racist concept. And it's still as strong even though people thought Obama's presidential period would solve this problem, and that now that blacks can be a president, that we don't have racism anymore. So some people are trying to reform the system, which I personally don't think can be done adequately. I think there needs to be a revolutionary change, a systemic change. But in the meantime, let's go with the reform approach, which most Americans want to try until they find out it isn't going to work. Some of the solutions I propose are that on a personal level, that we talk more about racism, and we talk about race, and we talk and learn and read about black history, about white power, about white privilege. We have to not be colorblind. Everyone thinks that's a positive feature, to be colorblind. We have to be color conscious. Colorblind means to think that everyone's the same and we all shake hands and kumbaya, and we don't look at the problems. We know people are defined by their color, and we should be color conscious. We have to make close friends with people of color, people who are discriminated against. You have to understand their culture. You have to understand their people. You have to be with them. You have to feel their situation. Even though you can't change your own color or your own ideology or ethnicity, you have to try to understand other people's situation. We have to organize groups in order to gain power to make change. And that's what's happening right now, because we can't do it ourselves. We have to work through organizations, either in institutional buildings or on the street, whatever. We got to work together and do this. All these people that are here on this panel are here because they're interested in this subject. And this is, the more people interested in this, more people that get together to make change will happen. And it's happening. There are things happening, many changes going on right now. So we have to talk about what is going to be the process of creating change. After this is all over, will it be another fad? Will we just go back to the same old racism that we always had, or are there going to be substantial changes? There's been demands made by the Detroit activists that are listed online, many of them. They're great ideas. I'm not going to try to list all of their ideas. The people in Seattle, and the CHOP district in Seattle has a lot of ideas on how to fix this problem. We have to, we also have the Minneapolis demands, and they abolished the police department recently. The council voted to get rid of it and refund into social programs for creating a department of community safety and violence prevention. New York City just diverted $2 billion out of the police department to be put into social programs. This is amazing changes that are taking place. The statues are being taken down, racist Confederate statues. Streets are being renamed. All sorts of things are being done now because of the massive protests. It would have never been done when this is, there's been protests for decades, and not major changes have been done because it hasn't been a powerful enough force. But now there is a time when we can make great change. So solutions that we've heard about are like a public oversight commission that would be overseeing the police department, if there is a police department. Where it would be, this commission would be free of police and government influence. It'd have to be by the citizens. There's a book called, I listed several books in the chat. If you're interested in some books, which I consider really relevant to this discussion. There's a book by Alex White called, Alex Vitale, V-I-T-A-L-E, called The End of Policing. And it explains exactly what the role of police are and what can be done to change. There's a book by Tim Wise called Colorblind. He's one of the greatest white anti-racist activists. He's written many books about racism. Colorblind is a great one. The New Jim Crow, we all know about. Michelle Alexander's great book on mass incarceration in a post-racial society, supposedly. But another book I want to recommend that really lays it out about the history of America and how slavery played a major role and how most people don't realize what side the slaves were on during the Revolutionary War. It's called the Counter-Revolution of 1776. When our country was formed, many black slaves went on the side of the British because they were promising the end of slavery. There's so many revelations in that book, Gerald Horne, H-O-R-N-E. So Just those books alone will provide many ideas on solutions to this problem. But I just want to mention a couple more and then I'll finish. Obviously, we have to demilitarize the police forces if we're going to have a police force. What's happened in the last 40, 50 years, and this is what Alex Vitale made a big point about, is that demilitarizing or changing the police color or diversity or training or anything is not the solution. The problem is in policing itself. The role of policing, the job of policing is wrong. It's been very militarized. Many reasons why it supports the status quo. And if you support the status quo, you're actually enforcing laws that maintain injustice that exists in America against homeless people, against the people who are mental illness, against drug users and other social ills that should be resolved by special therapists and other people, professionals that should deal with those issues. So those are just the tip of the iceberg of what has to be changed. We have to change the broken windows policy. I don't know if you're all familiar with that idea that, clutter and litter and people sleeping on the streets and all that creates a negativity in the city. So you have to enforce laws against those people because it's going to just make the whole city go down. And that's caused a lot of attack on minority communities. We have to stop the infiltration in Muslim communities where the FBI, I mean, this is a common, well-known fact that the FBI is infiltrating Muslim communities for terrorism, for terrorists. We have to have transparency on public expenditures on police expenditures. We have to know what's being spent on police, in what way and for what, so that we can address those and make changes. Rather than just blatantly say, stop funding police and just put everything over there. We have to know more about where the money is being spent. There's so many things that can be done just so many solutions. So I just want to put those out and thank you.
Thank you, Bill. And let me ask you one quick question. If you can take a real brief time to answer this one. Would introduction of race relations curriculum in middle or high schools all over the country, do you think it'll be instrumental in cleansing the young minds for an improved understanding and harmony among the different races and ethnicities? And, what do you think about that?
Well, that's my first point I made, was we have to talk and read and understand about race and other people's cultures, for sure, starting from birth. I mean, when you see a child being raised, there's a movie about this, I forget the title of it, but in the white supremacy group out in Montana somewhere, they raise their children from day one to hate black people, to hate Jews. I mean, it's like before they can even think. You have to start when a child is born to treat them, to educate them about harmony and working with other people and accepting everybody for what they are. So certainly by the time you get to middle and high school, absolutely, it should be in grade school, everywhere, at home, in businesses, everywhere. We have to teach about race relations and history. The more you can learn about it, the better sympathy we can have for each other.
Awesome.
Empathy.
Thank you so much, Bill. Thank you so much. All right, we're running tight on time, and I'm going to proceed to our next speaker. She is an attorney from the Metro Detroit community who has been practicing law for the past decade. She now has decided to run for public office of the Macomb County prosecutor. And this county's office over the last couple of years has particularly been in the news as being, plagued by corruption, male-dominated. She aims to bring honesty and trust back to that position. So welcome to Ms. Khalil, Saima Khalil, from the Metro Detroit area. You have heard our speakers and some of what we think are the CAPI members and other contributors to CAPI's wide audience that we have in Michigan and nationwide. The questions that they posed, and we tried to formulate those questions, narrowed them, and clubbed many questions to form a similar one, and we have been asking our speakers so far. So I'd like you to maybe, reflect on a couple of things that, notably, you might have heard that are impactful or at least appeal to you? And then also from a legal standpoint, from a jurisprudence standpoint, what are our options in this case? And I know that's a very big and loaded question, but I'm sure you can do justice to it.
Thank you. Good afternoon, everyone, and thank you so much for giving me the opportunity to be present this afternoon with you. And I'm an attorney. I've been practicing in Macomb County since I've gotten my license, heavily in Macomb County. There is very little minority representation in the legal leadership community in Macomb County. So you can imagine the challenges that individuals face when they come out here to practice law. Hearing from the other speakers, I just want you to know that I have had a lot of respect for activists and people that are on the ground and part of the movement. I've always had, but in particular in this time of movement, the work you're doing is phenomenal and it's appreciated, and you just have to keep on doing it. One of the things that stands out to me from what I'm hearing from the speakers is the community's voice is not being heard. And the community is basically consisting of us as voters. And so many people are discouraged from the voting process, and it's completely understandable because oftentimes when we are looking at our ballots, the people who are running are people we may be familiar with or heard of or read about, and they're not individuals that we may necessarily want to vote for because it's part of that same system. So that's very frustrating it's frustrating for me as a voter, and I've learned in this process of campaigning that it's very something that a lot of people are troubled with, the people that they vote for. So when I hear people complain about the not having their voice heard, it really concerns me because at the end of the day, you're a public official owes a duty to the public. So people that are in these positions are not doing a very good job of including the public voices in their administration. So in my situation, so in the office of the public prosecutor, that role is so deeply tied to the community that to essentially exclude the voice of the community, to not want to sit down with the community, to not hear the concerns, to not get the community involved and hear their suggestions is baffling to me. So I've heard some of the speakers refer to like an oversight board, and I'm looking at the timeline of when things happen. And so the passing of Mr. Floyd happened in May, and there's conversation going on in my county at least, but I don't know really what has been done. I've heard at different events I've gone to conversation about, we hired this many minorities, and that's not resolving the issue. There's a systemic issue of racism embedded within the legal community. And it's incumbent upon us as a community to get this out. And I know that some people think that the system we need to dismantle it entirely. That's a huge conversation to have. But the starting point for me is I would have liked to see an advisory board or some kind of oversight board started yesterday. There needs to be community representation on this board. There needs to be defense attorneys on this board, and that brings the voice of the community to the office of the prosecutor and express the concerns of the community and get the prosecutor's office on board. There is absolutely no reason why the prosecutor's office isn't doing something like that. And it's up to the community actually to make this happen. These are guidelines that come from the American Civil Liberties Union. And I would hope that in the very near future, we have this type of a board set up and having some sort of a monthly or a quarterly meeting. The other thing I think that would be very valuable from what I'm hearing is having, so I think what the research shows is that minorities are disproportionately charged. They're charged higher from prosecutors. They're charged more aggressively, but we don't have good data on that. So from a prosecutor's office perspective, Why aren't we putting this information together? Let the public know what's going on. The public has this information. We can sit down and have a conversation about it. The public has a right to know what the policies and practices are from the office of the prosecutor. And the more secretive you try to make it, the more you're angering the community. And that office, it belongs to the community. It doesn't belong to the select few and their friends. It belongs to the public, entirely to the public. So when the public stands up and says, we want this information, the prosecutor's office needs to be on board. The prosecutor's office is part of the problem. If they're not willing to give this information, if they're not willing to sit down, this is where the community's voice matters so much. I have to talk about voting because I believe voting and marching, you need a combination of that to get that change happening. If they're not making decisions that are in the best interest of the community, then people have to get up. People have to march. People have to get involved in that process. And I strongly encourage everyone to do that. The Office of the Prosecutor, there was a 1972 case. It was called Giglio versus the United States. And it was just want to make sure I'm clear on this. There needs to be accountability from the prosecutor's office. So when you have dishonest police officers, okay, and not all police officers are dishonest. I'm not saying that. I know one of the speakers earlier talked about not every white person, is a racist. I'm not talking about that. We're talking about some bad apples that taint a department, and then there's a culture that gets created that is not doing the right things for the community. If a police officer engages in dishonesty and it reaches the level of like a material misrepresentation or impeachment, the prosecutor's office is tasked with providing that information and making that disclosure. How do we hold the prosecutor's office accountable for this? If it's not happening, how do we hold them accountable for this? This case, it's a 1972 case, but it's still good law. The prosecutor's office needs to turn this information over and make this disclosure. If they're not, who holds them responsible? And this is where I think the advisory board or an oversight committee would be so instrumental in getting this information out. Essentially, it's the public pressure that's needed to get things done, because it's not going to get done if we are just having conversation. The other thing I think I referenced, making sure that the prosecutor's office makes their data available to the public, makes their policies available to the public. Again, there's no reason why that information shouldn't be made available. And ultimately, where we have situations of police brutality, it is definitely a difficult situation for the prosecutor's office to say that they're going to proceed and prosecute a police officer that's engaged in brutality, but that's what the prosecutor's office is tasked to do. Nobody is above the law, right? So those are just some of the things that I've come up with, and also in combination of listening to what was shared by the other speakers. So hopefully that's information that we can work on. And I really strongly emphasize the importance of an advisory committee and oversight committee. I think that could be impactful fairly quickly.
Awesome. Thank you so much. Thank you for that insight that comes from someone who's in the field and as part of the system and looking to be in the system and influence change from within. So with that, I believe we have run out of all the allocated time. If we need to have a follow-up session, whether another webinar or another in-person session at the Detroit or Michigan level, CAPI would be honored, privileged, and happy to be able to facilitate that. If there is one that's happening, please let us know so we can hopefully be of value add to that discussion, join that discussion, and be a contributing member. Again, Coalition of Americans for Pluralism in India. We are at www.capimichigan.org. So with that list of illustrious speakers with in-depth knowledge, with decades of experience, having seen this and provided solutions, I unfortunately am going to have to bring our session to an end. But before we go, I'm going to request that the that our esteemed Imam Khalid say a couple words of prayer, of dua, to end this session, and hopefully all the takeaways that we have, that people who are listening have noted down mentally or by writing, that we do continue to think in the solution phase. We continue to read some of the books that Bill Meyer has suggested, some of the thoughts that all of the speakers, in shortage of time, I'm not going to go through all the names, and there are salient highlight of what they had mentioned. But Imam Khalid, the stage is yours. Please lead us through our ending dua, and then we will adjourn today's session. We cannot hear you.
Let's take that off. Okay. In the name of God, who is most gracious and most merciful, we come to you this afternoon, knowing that no matter how much we plan, that our plans will come to nothing without your will. And so we ask that the commitments and the ideas that we have be those that are pleasurable to you, that you accept our sincere intention and give us the resolve to follow through in trying to change a situation that has been a part of the American landscape since the founding of this nation. In your name we pray. Amen.
Amen. Amen. And once again, thank you so very much for all the speakers. I know we did run over time by about 28 minutes specifically, but this is a much needed topic, a much difficult conversation, and hopefully going forward, we will continue to keep our minds in the solution phase and try to brainstorm and collaborate and synergize with each other to try to affect positive change for what's going on in this country. That I have high hopes. I have extremely high hopes that we will be able to move the needle on this one. So with those last words, again, thank you for all the participants. And I believe there's a conference room somewhere where some people have, some community members have collected and they're listening as a group audience. Thank you to you guys as well. Thank you for all the other participants. And most of all, thanks to my technical support team that has enabled this and brought this on. But last but not the least, again, a huge thanks and a warm applause to all of the speakers and your thoughts. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Thank you all.
Wa alaikum salam.
Wa alaikum salam wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh.